So how many times have you come to Concord?
Actually, this is my third time, and I come over to do a hands-on cooking course, which is a week long, so it's great for the students because they get to learn a whole array of different cooking styles, and they get to work together, and so they, create a whole host of different types of foods.
And how did you first get into macrobiotics?
I guess that's a good question in terms of when you can, call it actually macrobiotics. Just an interesting story, when I was born in February in England, it's pretty cold, and my mother thought it would be a good idea to put me outside in a pram every day. And apparently one time I said to her, "I can't believe you would put me out in a pram in February, it must have been freezing cold." And she said, "Absolutely not, you loved it and slept all the way through." And so I think maybe that made me have a kind of natural connection to nature, which I think most of us, all of us have, but sometimes we forget about it, or it gets kind of taught out of us. And then when I was 12, my mother actually went and had a macrobiotic meal at this son of her friends, and she came back and said to me, "Oh, I had this really interesting meal, and it was called macrobiotic, and there was seaweed." And I said, "How awful, it must have been ghastly." And she said, "No, actually it tasted delicious." And then when I was 16, there was a really ancient book on macrobiotics. I'm not sure who wrote it, I still don't remember, and I'm not sure even how I got this book, but it sort of appeared somehow. And it was old in the sense that I think the first thing you were meant to do is eat only rice and gamasio for 7 days, which is, the 7-day diet. And so, but it also suggested only eating this really, really small amount. And it was sort of literally about the size of a very small handful at each meal. And I didn't really get it, and I made the gamasio, but I don't think I made it right. And gamasio, by the way, is sesame seeds toasted with sea salt, and you grind it together, and it's a really good condiment. But I think I put sort of almost equal amounts of that to the rice. And I managed to do it for about a day, maybe a day and a half, and then Mum bought these biscuits back, which looked really good, sort of homemade ones, so I ended up eating that, and that was that out the window. But it must have sparked some interest in me, because I remember thinking at the time, this seems really brilliant, way to... I think then I was a bit more obsessed with my appearance than I was about my health, but I thought it sounded like a really good way to stay thin and, be active. And then, ironically, the guy who cooked that meal became my boyfriend, much to my parents' horror, because he was sort of a bit of a wild guy. And had been macrobiotic since the end of the 60s, and this was in the early 80s. So I could say I started because of love, because it was like he was one of those very charismatic people, and I was working in the fashion world at the time, and then he said to me, "Oh, if you eat this, you'll always never have to worry about your weight," and so that was good enough for me. And I didn't have a clue about how to cook the food. So actually, he lived in Bath, and I always remember this old house he lived in with slate floors. It all seemed to kind of go with the food, this very sort of earthy, natural type of environment. And he used to make tahini with a stone mill. And I remember one time he asked me if I could soak some beans, and he put them in a pan and said, you just cover them with water, and disappeared, and I hadn't a clue. So I think there was probably about a cup of beans in this big pot, and I just covered it right to the top with water, so it was probably about 10 times as much water, so it showed I didn't really have much of a clue.
Well, that's interesting, because I was going to ask if prior to this food had always been very important to you and to your family, or if your interest in food actually came through macrobiotics.
I always liked to cook, and I had this sort of idea at one time to go and study cordon bleu cooking. My mother really liked to cook as well, but it was more of a sort of traditional English style. But she did always have half our food, well, not half our food, but more or less half the plate at dinner would be vegetables, which was really great. And the thing I find interesting about English cooking, because there's a lot of jokes in throughout the world about how boring it is, but what's interesting about English cooking is it's very distinct, so you would know what you were getting. And I think there's an excellent aspect to that, because it makes you quite sensitive to the taste of food, and you're not covering it up with tons of sauces and things like that. So we did have a more simple style of food growing up. I think my favourite thing to cook then was desserts. Probably I was actually quite a good I used to ice wedding cakes and things like that. So I did always enjoy, like, you know, playing around with food and creating. But I can't say until I actually began to understand more about, you know, natural foods and foods from the earth that it became more of a thrill.
Because I think a lot of people are put off the idea of macrobiotics by it's seen as quite prescriptive, or it's seen as quite academic, and people struggle to really understand it. Is it something that you feel you could just explain to us? What is it? What is macrobiotics?
Well, one thing that was interesting for me, because I've heard that too, but for me I never felt that way, which is interesting. I think I was going through a phase right before I changed my diet to that sort of, you know, the crazy way of eating, you know, living on, say, cottage cheese and apples and maybe a diet soda or something like that. So when I started, it seemed like there was endless possibilities. I think what happened in the 80s, which was, I started at the beginning of the 80s, but in the sort of latter part of the 80s, it became quite well known as a cure for cancer. And because of that, it did have an appearance of being prescriptive. But if you actually look at books prior to that by, you know, Limo Sawa or Michel Abacera, a lot of those books had a really wide variety of foods. And then it became this sort of, it had a name for helping cure disease, not only cancer, you know, but that was a predominant one. And that had a more prescriptive feel to it. But actually, macrobiotics, the word means great life. And the word diet comes from the Greek dieter, which means way of life. So you could say macrobiotic diet means great life, way of life.
So it's almost unfortunate that there's that word diet because of the connotations it has now.
Exactly, because diet to most people is something you are prescribed to,
Yeah.
and if you don't stick to it, you've fallen off the wagon, whereas macrobiotics is really more of a way of life. So it's using diet in the original sense, way of life, diet. But there was a good point that you did bring up about it being sort of, you know, I think you said intellectual.
Yeah, academic.
Academic, yes. I think it's easy for it to become a heady thing, and sometimes people like that because then they don't really have to get into their bodies and feel it, so they, you know, enjoy the sort of conceptual idea of, say, a philosophy or a way of life. And for me it's more like really, you know, being practical and down to earth. And as I was mentioning, it did become prescriptive, but it's actually not prescriptive, because macrobiotics is understanding what's suitable for the individual or for yourself, and it's actually more of a choice. So it's like you make that choice to take responsibility for your own health and your own life and your own direction. Because one of the things that's interesting, if we look at health, health is not something we ever reach, it's a direction. Because many people say, you know, okay, I'm going to be healthy, but at what point? It's an ongoing experience. Because, you know, in a way health could wave, and you could have a big wave where you could have something more serious, but you could have small waves too, where sometimes you might get a headache or you might not feel so good. And so it's more of the direction, because then if you're taking responsibility for your health with simple home remedies and, you know, the food that nourishes you, then it's much easier to get back on track and go forward again. Understanding that those small waves are actually natural, and that's quite good because it shows that your body's sensitive and it's giving you a message that maybe you need to make a slight change.